I remember the cafeteria as a place of solace within the sprawling confines of the research facility where I worked. It was nestled in the heart of the building, a space where we could escape from the hum of machines and the sterile scent of antiseptic. The walls were a soothing shade of pale blue, dotted with abstract art pieces that, while unremarkable, gave the room a touch of warmth. The tables, arranged in neat rows, were often occupied by clusters of lab coats hunched over their trays, discussing the latest breakthroughs or simply enjoying a brief respite. For a long time, my routine was simple. Mornings were spent in the lab, afternoons in meetings, and lunchtime was my sanctuary. I cherished those moments when I could savor a hot meal while indulging in the gentle hum of chatter around me. It was here that I felt a sense of normalcy, a grounding presence in a world dominated by the frenetic pursuit of scientific discovery. The cafeteria staff were familiar faces, their cheerful smiles and pleasant small talk a welcome reprieve from the analytical conversations that filled my day. The food was never spectacular, but it was always warm and comforting, the kind of fare that reminded you of simpler times. Soups, stews, sandwiches, each dish was prepared with care, if not culinary flair. But then, something began to change. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you might not notice unless you were particularly attuned to the nuances of your environment. I first sensed it in the food. The flavors had shifted, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. The soup tasted different, with an unexpected bitterness that lingered at the back of my throat. The bread, usually soft and fragrant, had a dense, almost heavy texture. At first, I dismissed these observations as trifles. A change in supplier, perhaps, or a new chef experimenting with recipes. After all, everyone else seemed to eat without complaint, and the cafeteria buzzed with the same lively energy. But as days turned into weeks, the changes grew more pronounced, creeping into my consciousness with an unsettling persistence. There was an incident that marked the first real disturbance. It was a Tuesday, and I had just sat down with a bowl of beef stew, the aroma rich and inviting. As I lifted the spoon to my lips, I noticed something peculiar, a faint, almost imperceptible movement in my peripheral vision. Pausing, I scanned the room but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Dismissing it as a trick of the light, I continued to eat, but the sensation of being watched lingered, coiling tightly around my thoughts. The stew tasted off. There was an underlying flavor that I couldn't quite identify, something metallic and cold. I forced myself to finish the meal, trying to shake off the sense of unease that clung to me like a shadow. As I stood to leave, I looked back at my table and saw it, an empty chair, pulled out ever so slightly, as if someone had just vacated it. Days passed, and the feeling of unease deepened. I started noticing things that others seemed oblivious to. The way the cafeteria lights would flicker ever so subtly, casting brief shadows that danced across the walls. The low hum of the refrigerator units, which now seemed to carry a dissonant note, a vibration that resonated uncomfortably within my bones. And the food. It had become an enigma, each dish carrying a hint of something intangible, an aftertaste that left me lingering on the edge of comprehension. I tried to discuss it with my colleagues, but their responses were dismissive at best. "It's just your imagination," they said, their words punctuated by laughter and the clinking of cutlery. "We have enough on our plates without worrying about cafeteria drama." I wanted to believe them, to attribute my anxieties to overwork or stress, but the gnawing feeling of dread persisted. The escalation came one afternoon, a week later, when I decided to skip lunch altogether. Sitting at my desk, I tried to focus on my work, but the hunger gnawed at me, insistent and unyielding. Reluctantly, I made my way to the cafeteria, hoping a quick meal would quell the anxiety that thrummed beneath my skin. As I entered, a peculiar silence greeted me. The usual chatter and clatter were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. The tables were occupied, yet no one spoke. They simply stared at their trays, their movements mechanical and synchronized. I approached the counter, hesitating before selecting a sandwich, the bread looking oddly pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Finding a seat, I took a bite, the taste familiar yet unsettling. There was a whisper of something rotten, a decay that seemed to blossom on my tongue. I was about to stand and leave when I caught sight of something that froze me in place, a reflection in the window opposite me. It was my own, yet there was a flicker of another figure beside me, spectral and indistinct, watching with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I turned abruptly, heart pounding, but the chair next to me was empty, the space occupied by nothing more than a chill that seeped into my bones. My stomach churned, nausea rising as I pushed the plate away, my appetite lost. The climax of my ordeal came that evening. Exhausted and rattled, I returned home, hoping a night's rest would dispel the fog of dread that had settled over me. Sleep, however, proved elusive as my mind replayed the day's events in a relentless loop. I lay there, eyes fixed on the ceiling, when a sound broke through the silence, a faint tapping, like the gentle rapping of fingers on glass. Rising from bed, I followed the sound to the kitchen. The tapping persisted, rhythmic and insistent, coming from the window. I approached cautiously, heart hammering in my chest, and as I drew back the curtain, I was greeted by my own reflection, distorted and menacing, and beside it, the shadowy outline of an entity I couldn't name. I staggered back, the sound of my own breath loud in the stillness. The figure faded, leaving only the cold sheen of the window pane, yet its presence lingered, an echo that filled the room with an oppressive weight. In that moment, I understood. It wasn't the food itself, but the act of consumption, the intimate ritual of eating that had somehow become a conduit for something else, something unseen and malevolent. The following days were a blur of avoidance. I refrained from visiting the cafeteria, subsisting on hastily prepared snacks from home. I could no longer bear the thought of eating in that space, where the air seemed charged with a tension that threatened to unravel me completely. Even now, as I sit at my desk, the memory of that unseen terror lingers, a specter that haunts my thoughts. The cafeteria remains unchanged, a place of routine for those who can still find solace within its walls. But for me, it is a landscape of dread, a reminder of how easily the familiar can become foreign, how the simple act of consumption can be tainted by forces that defy comprehension. I have learned to live with the fear, to navigate the shadows that whisper at the edges of my vision. Yet, every so often, I catch a glimpse of a figure in the reflection of a window, or feel a chill that has no source, and I am reminded that some hungers are never truly sated, that there are depths within the mundane that harbor unseen horrors waiting to be discovered. The cafeteria and the laboratory facility was a place of routine, an island of normalcy amid a sea of relentless experimentation and discovery. The bright fluorescent lights created a world that was stark and sterile. Every day, scientists, technicians, and staff members would gather here to escape their experiments, if only for a brief moment. The air was always filled with the scent of industrial-grade coffee and the comforting aroma of various foods being prepared behind the cafeteria counter. I had been working at the facility for several years, primarily in the biochemical research department. My days were spent analyzing data, running tests, and contributing to the projects that promised to revolutionize medicine. But the cafeteria was where I found solace. It was a place where we could all shed the weight of our lab coats and talk as humans rather than colleagues bound by the cold, mechanical nature of science. The meals were usually quite ordinary: sandwiches, salads, soups, and the occasional treat when the chefs were feeling creative. Conversations would drift from discussions about the projects to idle chatter about the latest television shows or weekend plans. In this place, the world seemed predictable and safe. That is, until I noticed the first disturbance. It began with a subtle change in the food. At first, it was imperceptible, an odd aftertaste in the soup, a slightly different texture in the bread. Others noticed it too, of course, but we brushed it off as a minor change in suppliers or ingredients. We were scientists, after all, and data was our language. Without explicit evidence, there was little reason to dwell on such small discrepancies. However, the disturbances grew more pronounced over the following weeks. The salad greens seemed to wither more quickly. The fruits developed a cloying sweetness that lingered unpleasantly on the palate, and the meat had an uncharacteristic consistency that was difficult to describe. conversations in the cafeteria became less animated, more subdued. The food, once a source of comfort and energy, became an uneasy topic shared in hushed tones. Despite my misgivings, I continued to eat there. The cafeteria was still the easiest option, and besides, I was curious. A part of me, the scientist always seeking explanations, urged me to pay closer attention. I began to observe the food with the same scrutiny I applied to my experiments. I tried to identify patterns, potential causes, anything that could explain this strange phenomenon. But what truly disturbed me was that beyond the texture and taste, there seemed to be something else. Something unseen yet deeply unsettling. A presence. When alone in the cafeteria after hours, I felt watched, as though the food itself was aware of me. I shook off such thoughts as irrational, an effect of too many hours spent in the sterile glow of the lab. Then, the escalation. One evening, I stayed late to finish a particularly troublesome analysis. The facility was quiet, most of the staff having long gone home. My stomach growled, and I decided to head to the cafeteria for a late-night snack. Under the harsh lights, the room seemed different, more shadowed, more oppressive somehow. I approached the counter, where the leftovers of the day's meals were kept in warming trays. As I reached for a sandwich, I noticed a peculiar smell, a hint of decay masked by the usual cafeteria scents. I hesitated, but told myself it was just the remnants of a busy day and the overworked air conditioning failing to clear the air. I chose a sandwich that appeared fresh and sat alone at one of the long tables. The cafeteria was eerily silent, the only sound my own chewing and the faint hum of the cooling units. As I bit into the sandwich, that feeling of being watched intensified. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but I was alone. It was then that I noticed the sandwich tasted wrong. Not the kind of wrong that comes from a spoiled ingredient, but something deeper, more intrinsic, as if each bite was imbued with a whisper of something unnatural. I spat the food back onto the plate, my heart pounding with an unexplained dread. The taste lingered, coating my mouth with a strange metallic tingle. I left the cafeteria in haste, my mind racing with possibilities. What was happening here? What could cause such a pervasive sense of unease? I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, not just in the food, but in the very nature of the space itself. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the cafeteria grew more oppressive. Staff members began to avoid it, preferring to bring their meals from home or eat quickly at their desks. Those who did brave the cafeteria spoke in hushed voices, eyes darting to the corners as if expecting to see some lurking presence. The food continued to degrade. It became a point of unsettling focus. My curiosity, that insatiable drive that had brought me into the world of science, compelled me to investigate further. I began staying late, hoping to catch some anomaly in action. I combed through security footage, pored over supplier records, and even analyzed samples of the food. But each line of inquiry led to a dead end. The food was consistent with all known standards. The footage showed nothing out of the ordinary, and the suppliers were reliable as ever. Yet, the dread continued to build. The climax came one night when I was alone in the lab, reviewing some late results. Exhausted, I decided to take a break in the cafeteria. The room was dimly lit, the lights flickering occasionally as if expressing the same unease that I felt. I sat at my usual spot, the glow of the vending machines casting shifting shadows across the floor. I retrieved a small packet of crackers, one of the few items that seemed unaffected by the bizarre changes. As I sat there, a strange sound reached my ears, a low, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat pulsing through the walls. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and with it, the sense of being watched returned with full force. I realized then that it wasn't coming from outside the room, but from within. The cafeteria was alive with the sound, a pulsating entity enveloping me. I tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as fatigue or stress-induced hallucination, but the sensation was all too real. I could feel the thumping vibrate through the chair, resonate within my bones. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for the exit, abandoning my meager meal. As I fled, I could swear the shadows shifted, elongating as though reaching for me, trying to drag me back into their embrace. I slammed the door behind me, the sound echoing in the deserted halls, and ran until I reached the safety of my lab. The fear lingered long after, like a stain on my consciousness that refused to fade. I avoided the cafeteria from that point onward, joining the growing number of staff members who found reasons to eat elsewhere. The facility conducted a cursory examination, but nothing came of it. The findings were inconclusive, and the unexplained phenomena were brushed aside as mere anomalies, outliers in an otherwise controlled environment. Yet, deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The cafeteria remained a silent entity, a part of the facility that had changed in some fundamental way. It continued to watch, to wait. Its presence was an undeniable truth that haunted my thoughts, a puzzle without a solution. To this day, the memory of those nights haunts me. I can still feel the weight of that unseen gaze, hear the rhythmic thumping in my dreams. It serves as a reminder that not all mysteries can be unraveled, that some questions are best left unanswered. The cafeteria continues to operate, its secrets hidden behind the facade of normalcy. But those of us who remember, who felt the terror lurking within those walls, carry with us a lingering fear, one that whispers in the corners of our minds, a constant reminder that horror can dwell even in the most mundane of places. The cafeteria was a place I used to look forward to during the long, arduous hours of work within the laboratory facility. It was a haven of normalcy amidst the cold, clinical environment. The stainless steel counters shone under the fluorescent lights, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee intermingled with the scent of warm bread. Most days, colleagues and I would gather around the small round tables, sharing anecdotes about our experiments or mundane aspects of daily life. The cafeteria was alive with laughter and casual chatter, a stark contrast to the sterile silence of our workspaces. I remember the day the first disturbance occurred as clearly as if it were happening now. It was a Thursday, and the menu board proudly announced a new addition, a special dish, the chef's latest innovation. Curiosity, more than hunger, drew me to the lunch line. There was something about new offerings that broke the monotony, a small thrill in the midst of routine. The dish was innocuous enough at first glance, a simple stew, rich and hearty, served with a side of crusty bread. As I lifted the spoon to my lips, an inexplicable unease settled over me. It wasn't the taste. The stew was savory, perfectly seasoned. No, it was something else, something intangible. A whisper of dread brushed against my consciousness, but I brushed it aside, attributing it to fatigue from a particularly grueling week. Others seemed unfazed, enjoying their meals with gusto, their laughter undiminished. I finished mine, though the sense of foreboding lingered, shadowing my thoughts like an unwelcome specter. I returned to my work, but couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, a barely perceptible crack in the veneer of normalcy. In the following days, the air in the cafeteria felt different, charged with an unnatural tension. It wasn't immediately noticeable, not until one paid attention. Conversations were still vibrant, yet there was an undercurrent of something unspoken. I caught snippets of hushed conversations, colleagues exchanging furtive glances, their smiles tight-lipped. The menu began to change more frequently, introducing exotic dishes that seemed out of place. Each new meal came with an increasing sense of disquiet. The flavors were rich, delicious even, but there was a depth, an intensity to them that was unsettling. I began to notice that the food left a lingering aftertaste, something metallic and foreign. It soon became apparent that I wasn't the only one experiencing this. A few colleagues reported upset stomachs, unusual cravings, and vivid dreams. We dismissed it as stress. We all knew the pressures of our work could manifest in strange ways, but the dreams were particularly disturbing. They were vivid, almost lucid, filled with images of consuming, of being consumed. I would awaken with a start, my heart pounding, a cold sweat clinging to my skin. In the mirror, my reflection seemed different, my eyes wider, more alert, as if perceiving a world beyond the visible. The escalation was subtle, creeping up on us like a shadow at dusk. Meals became a daily ritual fraught with anticipation and dread. Some colleagues began skipping lunch, preferring to snack on items brought from home. The cafeteria staff, usually jovial, now wore expressions of unexplained fatigue, their movements slower, as though weighed down by invisible burdens. One afternoon, as I sat cradling a mug of lukewarm coffee, I heard a commotion from the far end of the cafeteria. A colleague, a quiet man named Peter, was standing, his face an alarming shade of pale. He was clutching his stomach, his eyes wide with fear. "I can't. It's in me," he stammered, before collapsing. The room erupted into chaos, people rushing to his aid, the cafeteria's eerie tension snapping into palpable fear. Peter was taken to the medical wing, and we were assured it was nothing more than a severe allergic reaction. Yet, the incident left a mark, an indelible stain on the fabric of our collective conscience. The cafeteria, once a refuge, now felt like a trap, its air thick with apprehension. Despite my growing apprehension, I found myself returning, compelled by a force I couldn't articulate. It was as if something beckoned me, an insidious lure hidden within the familiar walls. I noticed others experiencing the same pull, drawn to the cafeteria with a mix of reluctance and inevitability. The climax came unexpectedly, on a day like any other. The cafeteria was bustling, conversations intertwining into a low hum. I was eating, though my attention was elsewhere, lost in thought. Then, a sensation unlike any other, a sharp, searing pain that coursed through me, as if my very being was unraveling. Around me, others froze, eyes wide, forks suspended midair, expressions mirroring my own horror. It was as if the food had come alive, a malevolent entity seeking dominion over our bodies. I could feel it, a roiling presence within, demanding recognition. Panic surged through the room, a collective realization of the unseen terror that had been lurking beneath the surface. Plates clattered to the floor, chairs toppled as people fled, their faces masks of fear. In the aftermath, the cafeteria was closed, its doors sealed as an investigation ensued. The official explanation was food contamination, a rare strain of bacteria. But those of us who had been there knew it was something far more sinister. We spoke of it in whispers, the unseen terror that had taken root in our minds. Though the facility returned to its routine, the cafeteria remained a specter, a memory that haunted us. Some left, unable to endure the lingering fear, the pervasive sense of being watched, of being consumed. Others, like myself, stayed, driven by a need to understand what had happened, to confront the shadows that lurked at the edge of perception. I often dream of that day, the echo of fear that resonates through my subconscious. In my dreams, I am back in the cafeteria, the food before me, pulsating with life, whispering secrets I cannot comprehend. I awake with a start, the shadows of those whispers lingering in the corners of my mind. The cafeteria remains closed, but its presence is felt, an unseen entity in the labyrinthine corridors of the facility. We avoid it, yet we are drawn to it, compelled to remember, to bear witness to the unseen terror that once held us in thrall. The fear lingers, a reminder of the unknown forces that lurk beneath the veneer of normalcy, waiting for the moment to strike. The cafeteria was a sterile oasis in the heart of the sprawling laboratory facility, a place where scientists and staff sought a brief reprieve from their relentless pursuit of knowledge. The walls were an unyielding white, the floors polished to a gleam, and the tables arranged with an almost military precision. I had always found something comforting in the routine cleanliness of it all, the predictable rhythm of clattering trays and murmured conversations, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the enticing aroma of whatever the chefs had prepared for the day. I worked in the facility's research department, tucked away in an office filled with stacks of papers and screens blinking with data. The cafeteria was my refuge, my escape from the incessant hum of machines and the demands of deciphering the mysteries we probed daily. It was during one of these lunches, amidst the common clatter and hum of conversation, that the first tremor of unease crept into our lives. It started subtly, like a whisper at the back of my mind, a strange sensation, a creeping discomfort that I couldn't quite place. I noticed Marion, a colleague from biochemical analysis, frowning at her soup, stirring it with an unusual deliberation. She poked at the floating morsels with her spoon, her expression one of vague confusion. I watched her for a moment, distracted from my own meal, but when I asked if everything was all right, she merely shook her head, dismissing it as nothing. That evening, as I lay in bed, the image of Marion's uneasy face lingered with me. I rationalized it away, attributing it to fatigue or perhaps a miscalculated seasoning in the soup. Yet, as the days passed, the sense of disquiet only grew. More colleagues shared Marion's discomposure. Whispers started circulating about strange tastes and textures in the food, about an odd aftertaste that didn't seem to wash away no matter how much they drank. At first, I paid little mind to the gossip, focusing instead on my work and the comforting routine of my daily schedule. But as the unease spread, I began to notice changes in those around me. People were growing more irritable, their eyes shadowed with a restless sort of fatigue. Arguments flared over trivial matters, and laughter, once a staple in our communal lunches, grew sparse, replaced by a tense silence fractured only by the clink of cutlery on plates. I found it harder each day to ignore the growing apprehension within me. Meals that once brought comfort now left a lingering sense of dread. I watched my colleagues pick at their food with reluctance, their faces pinched with unspoken worries. The cafeteria, once a place of solace, had transformed into a stage for an unseen menace, a silent predator lurking just beyond the veil of the everyday. The rumors, too, took on a life of their own, spreading like wildfire through the corridors. Some claimed the food was contaminated. Others whispered of experiments gone awry, of something escaping its confines and seeping into our daily bread. I tried to dismiss these rumors as mere paranoia, a natural reaction to the stress of our work. But deep down, an insistent voice gnawed at my defenses, urging me to pay heed. The first real disturbance came one afternoon when a technician from the genetics lab collapsed in the cafeteria. He had been sitting at a table near the window, staring blankly at his untouched meal, when suddenly he gasped, clutching his throat with a look of terror. Panic ensued, chairs screeching back as people rushed to help, voices rising in alarm. The medic team arrived swiftly, but the technician remained unconscious, his pulse a fragile drumbeat beneath clammy skin. They took him away on a stretcher, and the cafeteria, for once, was left in a shocked, oppressive silence. I returned to my office, shaken, my thoughts a whirlpool of questions and half-formed fears. The incident was explained away as a sudden allergic reaction, an unfortunate but isolated event. But in the days that followed, more such incidents occurred, each adding a brick to the wall of dread building within me. People began skipping meals, preferring to eat hastily purchased snacks from vending machines or to bring food from outside. Yet, the facility had always prided itself on its strict regulations and security, ensuring that nothing could be brought in without thorough inspection. This new practice only served to heighten the sense of unease, as if by bypassing the cafeteria, we could somehow escape the shadow it cast. My own aversion to the food grew, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach each time I stepped into the cafeteria. The scientists conducted tests on the meals, searching for contaminants or chemical traces, but nothing conclusive emerged. The food was declared perfectly safe, yet we all shared the same nagging fear, a collective understanding that something was profoundly wrong. Every night, I dreamt of faceless figures around a long table, their plates piled high with food they never touched, their hollow eyes fixed on something just out of sight. I would wake in a cold sweat, the taste of ash lingering on my tongue, my heart pounding with a dread that defied logic. And then came the day when the fear reached a crescendo. I had been working late, caught in the throes of an experiment that refused to yield its secrets. The cafeteria was nearly empty when I finally entered, save for a few late-night stragglers like myself, their faces drawn and weary under the dim lighting. I approached the serving counter, my stomach a hollow ache, and selected a simple sandwich, hoping the plainness of it might ease the knot of tension that had settled in my gut. As I sat down, the room felt larger than usual, the silence pressing in from all sides. I took a tentative bite, chewing slowly, every sense alert for the slightest hint of wrongness. It started as a tingling on my tongue, a whisper of something bitter that spread like wildfire through my mouth. My throat tightened, panic surging. I dropped the sandwich, pushing it away with trembling hands. Around me, others were reacting similarly, faces twisted in expressions of revulsion and fear. It was as if the air had grown heavy, laden with an invisible toxin that seeped into our very being. The collective panic was palpable, echoing through the cafeteria as people stumbled from their seats, some retching, others shouting in confusion. I stood, my chair clattering to the floor, the room spinning around me. It was then that I saw it, the source of our terror. At the far end of the cafeteria, where the shadows pooled thick and deep, something shifted. It was not a creature, not something tangible or visible, but a presence, a distortion in the air that hummed with a malevolent energy. I felt its gaze upon me, a cold, consuming weight that threatened to crush my mind under its scrutiny. I stumbled backward, a scream lodged in my throat, as the presence seemed to pulse and writhe, its influence spreading outward. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the room, and the air hummed with a low, insidious vibration. I turned and fled, my heart a drumbeat of terror, desperate to escape the unseen horror that clawed at my sanity. Outside the cafeteria, the world seemed unchanged, the corridors stretching away in their familiar, clinical lines. But I knew, deep down, that something had irrevocably shifted. The terror of that night lingered, an indelible mark upon my soul, a constant reminder of the abyss that had yawned before us. In the days that followed, the cafeteria was closed for investigation. The incident explained away as a mass hallucination induced by stress and fatigue. New protocols were implemented, reassurances given, but none of it could erase the memory of that presence, that unseen entity that had watched us with such cold, dispassionate malice. I continued my work, finding solace in the familiar patterns of data and analysis, yet the fear lingered, a shadow that stretched long and dark in my mind. I avoided the cafeteria, my meals now composed of bland, safe fare prepared in the confines of my small apartment. I no longer trusted the sterile cleanliness of the facility, its promise of safety and routine tainted by the memory of that night. And in my dreams, the faceless figures still gathered around their silent feast, their eyes empty and vast, their hunger a void that could never be filled. They watched and waited, as I did, haunted by the fear of consumption, the dread of what lay unseen beneath the surface of our carefully constructed reality. In the heart of the sprawling laboratory complex, nestled between the nondescript corridors and bustling research wings, lay the cafeteria. It was a place devoid of charm or character, serving as a utilitarian fixture meant to refuel the minds and bodies of those who worked tirelessly within the labyrinthine facility. The cafeteria was a sterile environment, with white walls and rows of metal tables lined with equally unremarkable chairs. The air always carried a faint hint of disinfectant, mingling with the aroma of reheated meals and bitter coffee. Despite its uninspiring atmosphere, it was a hub of social interaction, a place where scientists, technicians, and employees gathered for brief moments of respite. I had been part of the facility for over a year, my work focused on the intricate dance of molecules and compounds in the chemistry lab. The monotony of my routine was only punctuated by the daily pilgrimage to this very cafeteria. Each day was a rotation of the same faces, each bearing the telltale signs of fatigue and dedication. Yet, there was an underlying comfort in the predictability, a sense of belonging to this quiet, insular world. The first stirrings of disquiet began with the arrival of a new shipment of food supplies. It was a routine occurrence, yet something about this particular batch unsettled me. The crates were nondescript, marked only with the facility's emblem and the date of delivery. As I watched from a distance, the staff unloaded them with practiced efficiency. My colleague, Dr. Harris, remarked on the freshness of the produce that day, a rare compliment in this sterile world. The apples gleamed with an unnatural sheen, their red skins almost too vivid to be real. At first, I dismissed my concerns as mere paranoia. After all, my life within these walls was one dictated by logic and reason. But as the days passed, a growing unease gnawed at the edges of my mind. The food began to taste different, subtly at first, just a whisper of a change. The bread was denser, the vegetables carried an unfamiliar tang. and the juice left a strange residue on my tongue. These sensations were so slight that they might have gone unnoticed had I not been paying attention. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the mundane stresses of lab work, but the cafeteria seemed to have taken on a life of its own. The murmur of conversation seemed softer, the clinking of cutlery against plates more pronounced. There was a palpable tension in the air, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something unseen to unfold. One afternoon, as I sat alone at my usual spot by the window, I noticed a group of researchers engaged in a heated discussion. Their voices, hushed yet intense, drew my attention. They spoke of changes in their cognitive functions, of lapses in concentration, and a fog that seemed to descend upon them at the most inopportune moments. I leaned closer, pretending to be engrossed in the latest journal, while absorbing every word. They speculated about the food, their eyes darting nervously toward the serving counter. The idea seemed absurd at first. How could the food, our daily sustenance, be the source of such disturbances? Yet, as I observed more closely, I began to detect patterns. The symptoms they described mirrored my own experiences, the subtle alterations in perception, the fleeting moments of confusion that I had attributed to fatigue. And then there were the dreams, increasingly vivid and unsettling, leaving me disoriented upon waking. That evening, curiosity compelled me to linger in the cafeteria long after the dinner rush had subsided. The staff moved about, cleaning and preparing for the next day. I approached one of the workers, a woman named Ellen whom I had spoken to occasionally. Her face was drawn, shadows etched beneath her eyes. I broached the subject cautiously, asking if she had noticed anything unusual. She hesitated, weighing her words carefully. "It's not just you," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "A lot of us have been feeling it. Something's not right with the food, but no one knows for sure what's happening." Her admission was a relief, a confirmation that I was not alone in my apprehensions. It emboldened me to delve deeper into the mystery that had begun to overshadow the mundanity of our existence. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the cafeteria grew more oppressive. Conversations dwindled to a trickle, as if everyone was suffocating under an invisible shroud. Some of my colleagues began to exhibit more pronounced symptoms, headaches, mood swings, and a pervasive sense of unease. The facilities administration, perhaps aware of the growing unrest, maintained a stony silence, offering no explanations or reassurances. Driven by an insatiable need for answers, I began my own investigation. In the quiet solitude of my lab, I conducted tests on the food samples, searching for any anomalies that could account for the strange phenomena. The results were inconclusive, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. The frustration was maddening, the feeling of knowledge just beyond reach. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I stumbled upon an old file buried deep within the facility's database. It detailed a series of experiments conducted several years prior, involving genetic modifications to enhance crop yields. The project, codenamed Eden, had been abruptly terminated, its results never published. The implications were chilling. Had these altered crops somehow found their way into our supply chain? The following day, I shared my findings with Dr. Harris. His reaction was one of disbelief, mingled with a trace of fear. "If what you're saying is true," he murmured, "then we are all part of an experiment, unwitting participants in something beyond our control." As the days turned into weeks, the situation in the cafeteria reached a fever pitch. People began to avoid the food, bringing their own meals or opting to skip meals altogether. The once lively hub of interaction had become a ghostly echo of its former self. The facilities administration remained silent, their lack of response only heightening our collective anxiety. Then, one fateful afternoon, the situation escalated beyond our worst fears. A researcher, driven to the brink by a series of violent hallucinations, collapsed in the middle of the cafeteria. Panic erupted, a wave of fear and confusion washing over those present. It was the breaking point, a stark reminder of the unseen terror that lurked within our midst. In the aftermath, the facility finally acknowledged the crisis. An investigation was launched, and the cafeteria was temporarily closed. The administration assured us that the food would be thoroughly tested and any potential threats neutralized, but the damage had already been done. The trust, once a cornerstone of our close-knit community, had been irrevocably shattered. Even with the cafeteria shuttered, the sense of dread lingered in the halls of the facility. Conversations were hushed, eyes filled with suspicion and doubt. The fear of consumption had seeped into our very beings, an invisible specter haunting our every thought. In the months that followed, the investigation yielded few answers. The food was declared safe, yet the psychological scars remained. I often found myself wandering the empty corridors, my mind replaying the events that had unfolded. The cafeteria, once a place of routine and normalcy, had become a symbol of our collective vulnerability. And though the facility resumed its operations, a lingering fear persisted, a fear of the unseen, the unknown. We had been reminded of how easily our lives could be upended, how fragile the veneer of normalcy truly was. The cafeteria, now reopened, stood as a quiet testament to the turbulent events, and within its sterile walls, the shadows of dread continued to stretch, serving as a perpetual reminder of the horrors that lay just beneath the surface. The cafeteria had always been a sanctuary of sorts in the sterile, white-walled labyrinth of the research facility where I worked. Despite its unassuming, utilitarian design, it was a place of reprieve from the endless hum and buzz of scientific machinery. Each day, as the clock struck noon, my colleagues and I would gather in this communal space, our minds seeking a pause from the complexity and precision of our work. The air, perpetually tinged with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the warm, inviting scent of baked goods, seemed to promise a comforting interlude. I recall the subtle clinking of cutlery against plates, the low murmur of conversation, and the rhythmic beeping of the coffee machine as constants, creating a soothing background symphony. These sounds were accompanied by the cheerful chatter of scientists from different departments exchanging updates, theories, and occasionally gossip over meals that were, if not gourmet, then at least satisfying. The cafeteria staff, a small team of dedicated individuals, never failed in providing a variety of meals that catered to our diverse tastes, making the place feel even more like a home away from home. It started almost imperceptibly, a slight change in the quality of the food. At first, no one seemed to notice. Perhaps it was because we were all too engrossed in our projects, the kind that often consumed our thoughts even during these breaks. The sandwiches were just a little less fresh, the soup a tad too salty, the coffee slightly more bitter. Yet, these were minor irritations, easily dismissed as anomalies in an otherwise consistent routine. However, as weeks turned into months, the changes became less subtle. I found myself hesitating before each meal, scrutinizing the glistening surfaces of salads, the sheen on slices of meat, the texture of bread. A vague unease began to settle over me, an unfounded suspicion that something was amiss. It wasn't just the taste or the appearance. There was an intangible quality to the food that seemed off, as if it carried a hidden, sinister intention. My observations were not isolated. Conversations around the cafeteria tables began to shift. What used to be light-hearted discussions turned to quiet, concerned whispers. Colleagues shared stories of unexplained ailments, stomach cramps, headaches, fatigue that coincidentally followed mealtimes. Yet, no one dared to voice the fear that perhaps our beloved cafeteria was the source of these discomforts. It seemed ludicrous, a betrayal of the safe haven we had always known. Then came the incident with Dr. Elmsley, a seasoned chemist known for his meticulous nature. He had always been a fixture in the cafeteria, his presence marked by his habitual lunch of a turkey sandwich, apple, and a cup of chamomile tea. One afternoon, as I was about to offer a polite greeting, I noticed him sitting stiffly, his eyes fixed on the remains of his uneaten sandwich. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by a taut, almost panicked expression. "What's wrong, Peter?" I ventured, taking a seat across from him. He hesitated, glancing around, as if wary of being overheard. I, I can't explain it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something not right with the food." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he was referring to. It's as if he paused, struggling to articulate his thoughts. It's as if it's not just food, as if there's something else there, something that shouldn't be. A chill crept up my spine, not just from his words, but from the realization that my own suspicions were mirrored in his. We both fell silent, the weight of his admission hanging heavily between us. From that day on, the sense of unease that had been simmering beneath the surface began to escalate. The cafeteria, once a hub of activity and solace, grew quiet. The usual din of conversation was replaced by an oppressive silence, punctuated only by the tentative clatter of cutlery. I found myself lingering at my desk longer, reluctant to join the others for lunch, opting instead for hastily packed snacks from home. And then things took a darker turn. Reports of inexplicable illnesses increased in frequency and severity. People spoke in hushed tones of vivid nightmares and disturbing visions that haunted their sleep, experiences that left them shaken and unnerved. The cafeteria staff, too, became withdrawn, their smiles strained, their movements mechanical as they served the meals. One evening, driven by a mix of curiosity and dread, I decided to stay late, hoping to observe the cafeteria after hours. As the facility emptied and the shadows lengthened, I made my way to the dimly lit space, the hum of the refrigeration units the only sound breaking the silence. I stood there, enveloped by the eerie stillness, my eyes drawn to the rows of stainless steel trays and the flickering fluorescent lights casting unsettling reflections. It was then that I noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer on the surface of the food displayed behind the glass counter. It was as if a thin veil of something unearthly hovered just above the dishes, distorting their appearance ever so slightly. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, compelled by a mix of fear and fascination. As I leaned in, I felt the air shift, a cold, unnatural breeze brushing against my skin, carrying with it a whisper of something ancient and unfathomable. In that moment, a realization struck me with terrifying clarity. This was no ordinary food. Whatever essence had seeped into it was not of this world, not meant for consumption by human beings. It was as if the cafeteria itself had become a conduit for something sinister, something that thrived on our unwitting participation. The next morning, I shared my experience with a select few colleagues whom I trusted, those who had expressed similar concerns. Together, we approached the facility's administration, presenting our findings with a mix of urgency and trepidation. To our surprise, they listened, their expressions grave as they took in our story. An investigation was launched, though details were scarce, and we were left with more questions than answers. As the days passed, the cafeteria remained open, yet its atmosphere was irrevocably altered. The food, though reportedly tested and deemed safe, continued to exude an aura that repelled rather than invited. Many of us, myself included, chose to bring our own meals, seeking comfort in the familiarity of our homemade lunches, a small act of defiance against the unknown. But the fear, once awakened, was not so easily dispelled. Even outside the confines of the cafeteria, I found myself haunted by a lingering sense of unease, a shadow that loomed over my every meal. At home, in the quiet moments before sleep, I would replay the events in my mind, unable to shake the feeling that we had merely scratched the surface of a deeper, more insidious truth. The cafeteria, once a place of respite, now stood as a reminder of our vulnerability, a symbol of the unseen forces that lurked just beyond the veil of normalcy. We had encountered something beyond our understanding, and though the immediate threat had seemingly passed, it left behind a scar, a constant, gnawing awareness of the limits of our perception and the fragility of our reality. In the end, what haunted me most was not the fear of the food itself, but the realization that our world was not as solid, not as predictable as we had believed. There were cracks in the surface through which the unknown could see, altering our lives in ways we could not fully comprehend. And as I sat alone at my desk, my untouched lunch before me, I knew that the true horror lay not in what we had discovered, but in what remained hidden, lurking in the shadows, waiting to be unveiled. I remember the cafeteria as being rather bland, a place of muted colors and dim lighting, the sort of space that seemed to absorb sound rather than generate it. It was tucked away in the basement level of the research facility, a remote corner where the hum of fluorescent lights reigned supreme. The air always carried a faint aroma of reheated pasta and overly salted soup, lingering far longer than anyone wanted. In many ways, it was the epitome of mundane, a sanctuary for those of us who preferred routine and predictability over excitement. We were a small team of researchers dedicated to our tasks in genetic engineering. Our lives cycled through the sterile corridors and the impersonal lab stations. Lunch in the cafeteria was a shared ritual, an opportunity to disconnect from the demands of our projects. Even our conversations rarely strayed beyond the banalities of daily life. The latest research updates and the occasional debate about which prepackaged dessert was the least disappointing. But one particular day, I found myself seated at my usual spot by the window, tracing the patterns of rain trickling down the glass, when a change in the atmosphere settled over the room. It was subtle at first, an unsettling quiet that descended like a shroud. The familiar clatter of utensils and the murmur of voices seemed to fade, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. It was as if the air had thickened, the usual flow of idle chatter abruptly stilled. I glanced around, catching the eyes of my colleague, Helen, who sat across from me. Her fork was suspended mid-air, a piece of lettuce precariously perched on its tines. We exchanged a glance of mutual bewilderment, a silent acknowledgement that something was amiss. But before either of us could voice our concerns, the lights flickered once, twice, and then steadied. The moment passed, and the cafeteria resumed its customary hum, but the unease lingered, like a shadow lurking just beyond our perception. It was an ordinary day, yet it felt as though the room had momentarily slipped into another realm, one where the familiar had been replaced by something vaguely disquieting. We shrugged it off, attributing it to an overactive imagination or perhaps a momentary power fluctuation. However, the sense of disturbance refused to dissipate entirely. Over the next few days, a series of minor anomalies began to creep into our routine. The food, traditionally uninspiring yet reliable in its consistency, started to change. It began subtly, with slight variations in flavor that weren't immediately noticeable. The soup was a touch too bitter, the sandwiches oddly textured. We exchanged puzzled looks over our trays, but no one seemed eager to voice their discomfort, perhaps reluctant to admit that anything was genuinely wrong. Yet, as the days wore on, the changes became more pronounced. The food developed an inexplicable quality, a strange metallic aftertaste that clung to the palate long after the meal was finished. I found myself lingering in the lab longer than usual, postponing lunch in the hope that by the time I arrived, the sensation would have dissipated. But each time, it greeted me with the same uncanny persistence. Helen, ever the pragmatist, began to speculate. "Perhaps it's a new supplier," she suggested, though her voice betrayed a hint of skepticism. Others agreed, nodding in unison, clinging to the plausible explanation as one would to a lifeline. The notion that the cafeteria's suppliers had changed was comforting, rational, but deep down, we all sensed it was something more. The climax of our unease arrived unceremoniously one afternoon. I had been seated at my usual table, staring absent-mindedly at a bowl of soup that seemed to shimmer in the fluorescent light, when the room was plunged into sudden darkness. It lasted only a moment, but in that brief interval, the silence was so profound, so absolute, that it felt as if the world had been momentarily suspended. When the lights returned, I became acutely aware of a change, subtle yet undeniable. The air was heavier, charged with an indescribable tension. My colleagues appeared equally disoriented, their expressions mirroring my own confusion. And then, as if on cue, we collectively shifted our attention to the food. The dishes before us had become grotesque parodies of themselves. The soup, once a staple of our midday routine, now swirled with an unnatural viscosity, its surface marred by iridescent streaks. The sandwiches, usually predictable in their blandness, had taken on an unsettling appearance, their contents unrecognizable, almost alive in their shifting forms. A shared gasp echoed through the cafeteria, a collective recognition of the bizarre tableau before us. A few voices rose in nervous laughter, a feeble attempt to dispel the growing dread. But the laughter was hollow, strained, an inadequate response to the inexplicable. I pushed my tray away, the taste of metal lingering on my tongue, a claustrophobic sense of being trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. Driven by an instinctual need to escape, I rose from my seat, my movements mirrored by others, a silent exodus toward the exit. As I reached the door, I turned back for one final glance, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy. But the cafeteria remained an oppressive presence, its silence more deafening than any clamor. In the days that followed, the cafeteria transformed into a place of avoidance, a space we navigated with trepidation. We began bringing our own lunches, preferring the certainty of familiar tastes to the unknown offerings that now occupied the cafeteria's counters. Conversations about the phenomenon dwindled, replaced by a tacit agreement to refrain from discussing the inexplicable. Yet, the fear lingered, an insidious presence that colored our interactions and cast a pall over the facility. We found ourselves working later hours, each of us driven by a need to remain occupied, to drown out the unsettling thoughts that threatened to surface in moments of solitude. Late one evening, as I wrapped up my research for the day, I wandered back to the cafeteria, driven by a compulsion I couldn't quite articulate. The room was dark, the lights extinguished for the night, yet I could sense the presence of something unseen, a watchful presence that seemed to echo my every step. Standing at the entrance, I peered into the murky shadows, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement, a ripple in the air that defied logic. My rational mind dismissed it as a trick of the light, a product of fatigue and overactive imagination. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cafeteria was more than just a room, that it harbored a secret we had yet to uncover. The mystery of the cafeteria remained unresolved, a ghostly specter haunting our collective consciousness. It was as if the room had absorbed some essence of our fears, manifesting it in the food we once ingested without thought. We carried on, our lives suspended in a delicate balance between the known and the unknowable, each of us haunted by the sense that the cafeteria held a truth we were not yet prepared to confront. The stainless steel tables glistened under the clinical fluorescent lighting of the laboratory facility's cafeteria. Every day, at precisely 12:30 p.m., employees would find solace from their meticulous and often mind-numbing tasks amid the trays of bland yet nourishing food. The daily offerings were predictable, a rotating menu that rarely deviated: sandwiches, soups, the occasional stir-fry, and salads, served with robotic efficiency by a kitchen staff that seemed as much a part of the machinery as the equipment in the labs. It was a place of routine and respite where scientists, technicians, and administrators exchanged hushed conversations about breakthroughs, deadlines, and weekend plans. The air was filled with the faint hum of the industrial ventilation system, a comforting background noise that accompanied the clatter of cutlery and the murmured voices. For me, it was a necessary pause in an otherwise hectic schedule. My work in the facility's research department was demanding, and these midday breaks were a tether to normalcy. Yet, one unassuming Thursday, as I settled into my customary seat by the window, something felt askew. The air carried a barely perceptible scent, an unfamiliar and slightly acrid odor that seemed to cling to the back of my throat. I looked around, searching for any visible source of the smell, but everything appeared unchanged. The cafeteria carried on as usual, the employees engrossed in their meals and conversations. I shrugged it off, attributing it to an overcooked batch of meat or a cleaning solution lingering from a recent scrub down. It was during the following days that the first disturbance became noticeable. The cafeteria's food, while never gourmet, began to take on an odd, almost metallic taste. At first, it was subtle, an undertone that I could dismiss as a figment of my imagination. But with each passing meal, the flavor grew more pronounced, an insidious presence lurking beneath the familiar tastes. Others began to notice too. Whispers of dissatisfaction spread among the tables, though none could pinpoint the anomaly's origin. The kitchen staff, enigmatic and reticent, offered no explanations. They moved with their usual precision, serving meals with practiced indifference, their faces inscrutable masks that betrayed nothing. Concerned, I approached one of the chefs, a middle-aged man with weary eyes and a perpetual frown, but his response was curt, dismissive. "Nothing's changed," he said, his tone brooking no further inquiry. The escalation came stealthily, like a shadow creeping over the threshold. More and more of us began to feel the effects. It wasn't just the taste. It was a sensation, a creeping, inexplicable anxiety that accompanied each bite. My appetite waned, and I noticed others pushing their trays away half finished, their expressions mirroring my own unease. A few colleagues even reported mild stomach discomfort, though it was never severe enough to warrant medical attention. It was as though the cafeteria had become a crucible for some unseen force, an entity that lurked within each morsel we consumed. Despite the growing discomfort, the administration remained conspicuously silent. Their memos continued to emphasize productivity and deadlines, with not a mention of our cafeteria woes. It was as if they were either oblivious or willfully ignorant of the growing discontent. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the cafeteria turned increasingly oppressive, the once comforting hum of the ventilation now a subtle reminder of our collective disquiet. The climax arrived on a day that felt no different from the others, yet it was marked by an unnerving stillness as we filed into the cafeteria. The metallic taste had reached a crescendo, an assault on the senses that no amount of seasoning could mask. As I sat with my tray, staring at a bowl of soup that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural sheen, a colleague seated across from me let out a choked cry. His face contorted with revulsion, he pushed his tray violently, sending it clattering to the floor. "There's something in it," he gasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes wide with horror. The room fell silent, all eyes turning towards him. Several others began to inspect their own meals, prodding cautiously at their food with forks, as if expecting it to leap from the plate. A young woman at the next table dropped her spoon, her face pale and drawn. "I can't eat this," she whispered, her voice trembling. It's alive." Pandemonium followed. Trays were abandoned, and the once orderly cafeteria erupted into chaos as people scrambled to distance themselves from the food, fear evident in their hurried movements. I too abandoned my meal, the ever-present metallic tang now mingling with a rising panic. No one could explain what was happening, not even the usually unflappable staff, whose calm facades finally crumbled. The unseen terror that had plagued us now manifested as a palpable dread, a fear of consumption that transcended reason. As we fled the cafeteria, the once familiar space now felt like a sinister trap, its purposes twisted into something malevolent and alien. The days that followed were marked by a lingering fear that refused to dissipate. Many of us avoided the cafeteria altogether, opting to bring meals from home or skipping lunch entirely. The administration finally acknowledged the situation, though their statements were vague, attributing the incidents to routine maintenance issues and assuring us that steps were being taken to address our concerns. Yet, despite their assurances, the shadow of unease remained. The cafeteria, once a haven of routine and normalcy, had become a symbol of our vulnerability, a reminder of the unseen terror that had breached our sanctuary. Even as the metallic taste faded and the food returned to its bland, predictable state, the memory lingered, an indelible mark on our collective psyche. I found myself returning to the cafeteria out of necessity, though each visit was accompanied by a heightened awareness, an instinctive wariness of what might lurk beneath the surface of my meal. The fear of consumption, once unfounded, now lingered like a specter, a constant companion to every bite. The laboratory facility, with its sterile corridors and relentless pursuit of knowledge, had become a place of uncertainty, its cafeteria a threshold to the unknown. Thus, we continued our work, the rhythm of our days unbroken, but forever altered. The cafeteria stood as a testament to the fragility of our perceptions, a place where the boundaries between the mundane and the monstrous blurred into one. And although the taste of metal no longer haunted our meals, the memory of that eerie encounter remained, a reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors are those that remain unseen.